Everybody, it's Mark Ross, June 16th. Oh my gosh, can't believe it. It's 11 on the East Coast. I'm here today with Aimee Carter. Aimee, how are you? Where are we finding you?
I am actually in Bowie, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C.
Love it,
Nice to see
Maryland.
you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for doing this. I'm super interested in your background, especially your international focus, strategic partnerships. You work for some of the most interesting, I'd say most serious, most important nonprofits in America. The Business Roundtable, Council for Foreign Relations, the AARP, which by the way, I turned 50 and they are very kindly sending me stuff. They're very on top of it, which is great. And now you're doing healthcare policy. So can you just talk from a macro perspective, what you see your focus as, like strategic partnerships, connecting public-private partnerships, getting people together to do important stuff?
Sure. Well, it's throughout my career I've done that, and I kind of fell into it because I, like you, I'm around 50, a little bit older, and there wasn't this whole idea. This was actually before international. Well, there was international relations, but before sort of people really talked about geopolitics and things like that. I worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and I
Oh, wow.
happened to work. It was really fantastic. I happened to work on a project where the project overall lead commissioner was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor.
Yeah.
And it was called this EU. It was the the U.S. EU Poland Action Commission. And essentially what it was bringing together U.S., European, and Polish business together with the public sector.
Wow.
To say, hey, this is back in the early 90s. Hey, here are some of the things that the private sector needs to see in Poland in order to invest more as Poland was emerging from, its previous history, to say that. And I really love the idea and really truly believe in that idea of the private sector, the public sector, and what we call civil society or civic organizations working together to improve the environment for whatever particular country. And so that's been my sort of ethos throughout my career, sort of the thread throughout my career and throughout how I think of partnerships. There is not one single organization or one single sector that has the absolute answer for any issue, but it is going to be, how do you bring those different sectors, perspectives, voices together in a safe and collaborative space to either have, really challenging conversations and or big think, hey, what can we do to work together to sort of improve something? And so that's been sort of the thread throughout my career. And I have, right now, I'm working in like I said, a small healthcare policy organization. I don't have a health policy background. So when the organization reached out to me, and I was like, well, I don't do this, I don't know this, and I don't know this. But what you do sounds really interesting. Love to be part of the leadership team and help sort of shape the future. And what I like about the organization is that it's really trying to. Healthcare policy, at least in the United States, is very contentious. It's probably that way globally, but it is trying to bring together, again, those different perspectives, voices to work through thorny issues. We're also trying to educate policymakers on the basics of just health policy issues. And then we try to just bring some information to the general public so that we're all informed, so that we can all work together toward a better solution.
That's amazing. Going back to Poland.
Very pie in the sky.
No, but that's good. I mean, I think, well, first off, I got to go to Poland, I think it was in 2009, maybe 2008. Gdansk, Poland, which was amazing. I'd never been there. And it's fantastic. And just the amount of transformation, investment. And yeah, this idea, I don't think enough people, I did this global MBA program, and I had a lot of smart classmates who were doing like traditional business. I was obviously much more from the geopolitics, government side. My nickname was Senator because I actually understood or had some understanding of the Constitution. But my classmates never really understood the amount of kind of interaction, public-private partnership, how much time CEOs spend in DC and in Brussels and other important capitals to really work with governments, because either they have the resources or the wherewithal or the interest to maybe expand markets or seek other challenges. And governments, it seems to me, over the last 30 years have gotten much more embracive or smart about working with public sector folks to try to move the situation forward or try to solve problems. Some of these problems, as you rightly point out, can't be solved by one institution or one government. They really need a global solution.
Right.
Do you see that continuing, or is that just are we at the zenith of it, or is there more opportunity there, and then are other businesses coming forward and say, hey, I want to find a way to get involved and help out?
Yeah, no, I don't think. I think this is something that's here to stay in terms of public-private partnerships. It's been around. I used to work at Booz Allen Hamilton also, which is a big management consulting firm. I worked in a small part of the firm that did projects for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and even within that, we were focused specifically on helping emerging market and developing countries improve their business environment or their environment for business. So very similar theme coming out of when I worked at CSIS. And it was this whole idea of the same thing, bringing in private sector, people with private sector expertise at that, to say, hey, here's at least black letter law. Here's how the sort of Western democratic world, writes black letter law. And here's how the institutions function. And here's how the civil society engages in the entire process and all that. And that was in the late 90s. So I think we're actually still at the in the arc of history, we're still at the beginning, I think, of this idea of public-private partnerships. I think it's only going to accelerate because oftentimes, particularly if you look at technology, the private sector is just moving so far ahead at light speed, and policy / government, whatever, it just can't keep up. I don't necessarily think it was designed for the future. They didn't know back then. So I think there's this understanding amongst public sector officials that, hey, the private sector has great expertise and has a role in this process, and we all need to work together. Sometimes the working together doesn't always, it just takes some time because the private sector they have a mission. Generally, it's to make money, create jobs, whatever. And so there, it's always this tension of like trying to find where we can meet and work together on issues. Then there's the whole civil society, the nonprofit world that I work in, which is a policy world. But then there's also the nonprofit.org world that is more in civic engagement or more grassroots level, and sort of all those different pieces, I think, are still figuring out ways to work together. And there's some ways that people do work together. There's lots of workshops and collaborations. Where I work, we pull together programs and meetings and solution salons and all kind of thought leader groups and all that kind of stuff. But there's going to be, and I think the pandemic was a potential silver lining, if you think of that, from the pandemic, was this ability to, we just needed to work together.
Right.
I mean, we just needed to work together, to get the vaccines out there. That way I get to actually have a vaccine and get it out there. But there was I think this is the whole idea of like a different way of collaborating, not only just in the virtual world, but just a different way of collaborating came out of that. And so I think we're also sort of figuring that out as like what the future looks like. So I think short answer, no, I think we're not at the zenith. I think this just continues and deepens.
No, good. I'm optimistic like you. I both of you, I worked for the U.S. China Business Council, which had all these like crazy CEOs, like, I'd call them masters of the universe. And, obviously the Business Roundtable, Council of Foreign Relations, very serious, very, global people. Sometimes I think like it's so intense that, and it's not inviting, that kind of small and mid-sized businesses, which are substantial in their own right, are like, how do I get involved, or where do I do, or I'm not really part of this. I was speaking to some small businesses in Richmond a few weeks ago, and I was like, hey, 100 miles away, there's 180 embassies that, you don't have to go to Norway to meet a Norwegian. You can go to DC to the embassy, and, if you're going to come to meet your senator, spend a few times going to the German embassy or, the Nigerian embassy, like get to know other folks. And part of it is just, I don't know if it's like education or making people feel more welcome. I assume with your strategic kind of partnership, like you're always trying to, I would assume, think about, do we have the right people at the table? Do we have a good mix? Can you talk about that?
Sure. So it's really interesting where I've always been in a situation where I've worked with the Fortune 500 executives in the Fortune 500. And that's very easy. which are
are
great. They
great,
have
but
the
it's like,
resources.
yeah,
They have
it's
the
like
resources, the
it's
time, the
otherworldly too.
people, and whatever.
Yeah.
But so when I was at the Business Roundtable, which is, Fortune 500 companies, it does a lot of really good work, and particularly in a really challenging time period. The Business Roundtable was very visible on sort of, I guess, non-economic issues, and I would take a lot of calls from smaller and medium-sized businesses that that wasn't our mission. We were the
Right.
big guys, and so I was trying to think of ways to, like, what are some opportunities for these smaller organizations to engage. And I love your point about going to the embassies. The challenge is, if you run a small business, you only have but so much time to be away from that business.
No,
And anyway,
I agree. These
but
small
it's a great
businesses were
idea.
also, yeah, they were also looking at me like, yeah, dude, like that sounds great, but
Yeah,
I've got
but I'm not
47
running a
other things.
business. But so where I'm
Right.
working now, it's actually, since we're a small organization, we do have this mix. They've actually primarily worked with smaller nonprofits, smaller, well, maybe not necessarily smaller, but organizations that are only focused in the healthcare industry as opposed
Right.
to the economy writ large. But particularly in healthcare, there is an interest from large employers as well as pharmaceutical companies and those kind of companies that have been in the healthcare industry, which is where we've traditionally, where I work is traditionally, they've traditionally worked with them. And I'm saying, hey, but there's all these large employers who want to be involved in healthcare conversations, and frankly, probably should be, because they're going to be either affected by costs or driving costs, have lots of employees, whatever. So we're looking at opportunities to bring those folks in. And for us, at least for where I work, we're very intentional about saying, okay, we've got this particular issue we're working on. Who are the key players? But then we say, okay, we need to make sure we get someone from not just the DC people, because, frankly, people from inside the Beltway talking with each other, they don't actually solve everything. So we're very intentional
Amen.
about, like,
Yeah.
okay, we need to
Preach.
get
I
someone
hear
from the
you. I'm
Midwest. We need to
totally,
get someone
yeah.
from the West Coast. We need to get someone from all the political from the two different political spectrums, because now there are more than just two. And then we need to include actual just person voices, because I think it's helpful. And we've seen this in the storytelling through the pandemic. We need to just get voices, that what we call the lived experience, people that can actually tell their story, so that it actually, you can relate the policy to the person, and
Right.
that the big businesses are really good at that also, is being able to pull out those individual stories. So one of the things that we have, we do matrices, and we take a look at who are the different types of, like, not who, but what are the different types of skills or functional interests that we need to have as part of this conversation. And then, we will do desk research. We'll reach out to our contacts, reach out to other contacts, and just say, hey, who's the best organization and or person to bring into this conversation. So we're very, like, my organization, I don't have any expertise in healthcare. And some of us do have some really specific healthcare expertise. Most of us are more generalists. So we're very open about saying, we're not experts in, this particular issue, but we'll go talk to the experts about who to bring in. Unfortunately, because we're not an expert in an issue and we don't advocate, we're seen as this safe space that is at least trying, that we have the good intention to bring together people that are willing to have tough conversations or just interesting conversations.
Yeah. So as you healthcare policy, obviously I'm a user of healthcare, but I can, like, shaping healthcare policy, oh my gosh.
That's the extent of my knowledge also.
But how do you decide, like, is it starting, is it either you start with the issue and then work back to say who should be at the table, or is it like, we have this group of people, what should we talk about, or is it a combination of both?
So it really is, I've got colleagues who are in the federal affairs side of things, and they're always on the Hill talking to the relevant sort of committee offices, the parts of Congress that deal with healthcare issues, and they're getting feedback and input from those people to say, like, hey, here are the big issues we're facing. Here's what we don't know. Here's where we could use some education. Here's where we could use the alliance to pull together people to have a conversation. At the same time, my team, since I lead development and communications, we're talking to the potential funders, and that might be foundations, it might be high net worth individuals, it might be philanthropists, it's definitely corporate entities, and everyone else in between, to say, hey, what are some of the issues you're facing? What are some of the things that you don't think policymakers understand, or you would like them to understand better about where your aspect of the issue or where you sit? What are some of the emerging issues that you're seeing? Where is it that the Alliance can be helpful? And then also, because we have just we've got board members, and we've got a great, we've got a lot of people who have just general healthcare expertise, who have masters in public health. They're always thinking, they're like, hey, here's some of the issues that we're seeing in the news. And they'll reach out to their sort of counterparts. So it's not the Alliance staff saying, hey, this is the important issue out there that everyone should convene on.
Right.
It's that we're going out and talking to our networks and people, and eventually themes will bubble up, and we'll say, okay, this theme has bubbled up. So for example, we had this huge project on patient, it's envisioning a patient-first healthcare system, and that kind of bubbled up. I'm like, okay, so we'll pull together a really complex project on that. Clinical trial, diversification in clinical trials have bubbled up. And so we've got a project on that. And so it's not the Alliance staff that are saying, hey, here's what's important. It is, we've gone out and sort of gathered all these insights and had these conversations with folks. And then we sort of synthesize that and say, okay, based on what we've heard, here's what's important in the policy environment right now, with this policy window, with this political window, or what's going on in the health environment, or what's going on in business.
So how do you, there's a lot of, I guess there's probably 1,000, maybe, 2,000 healthcare policy issues, right? And then how do you decide, like, when it reaches, when it bubbles up to the point where it's like, there's something here that we really need to talk about, and then how do you make sure that you stay on track and say, remember, this is what we decided to talk about? Because I'm sure other people are like, hey, I want to be part of that. Or then, how do you stay on mission, so to speak?
Right. Yeah. That's all the fun stuff. So I think
can you talk about, because I assume you are, obviously you're strategic and you're hoovering up a lot of information.
Yeah.
I assume you've got some really good diplomatic skills. But you're also, I assume, very good at like keeping people focused. So can you talk about your skill set, how you, you're really managing a lot of egos, a lot of people, and complex topics?
Well, and so the organization is writ large, and we have people who have very good political instincts. I don't have those political instincts because that's just not my background. I am in the generally the corporate affairs, corporate partnerships space. But where the two spaces that we really operate in are where there are emerging issues and where there's an opportunity to bring people together. And then also if there are, and then sort of future issues. And if there's an issue, then that's sort of here. And then the other side of the spectrum, it's where there is an issue that's just gotten stuck. People really want to move the ball forward. They just don't know how and can't really get together to do it. So there is interest from different perspectives to actually come together.
Right.
Where we don't tend to operate very much is where there's significant legislation advocacy, where that period is really intense. Because then it really is on the advocacy side of things, and that's just not what we do. So we're very careful about doing it. Like, here's some of the emerging issues that were heard, and here's where things are getting stuck. And we can play in those two spaces where people are more likely to come together outside of their political or interest group interests, if that makes sense. And we'll to a DC maybe crowd, maybe not to a broader crowd, sometimes not even to me. But so generally for me, I, because I have this background of working and developing in emerging market countries where a lot, when I worked, for example, I worked in Croatia on a project. It was looking at the business environment in Croatia. And when we got there, we were just like, okay, we were just using our, 4-syllable management consulting terms. And our interpreter was like, yeah, I can't actually translate the word management consulting into Croatian. We were like, wow, oh, okay. So then I was like, okay, well, let's back it up and let's figure out how do we break it down to a basic level that makes sense to people. which I think is really difficult for consultants and really difficult for people in the Washington, D.C. area or in any sort of political. And you just get into your jargon.
Yeah.
That means things to you, to people in your world, but it doesn't mean things to my family.
Well, sometimes they're used also to, like purposely exclude people. Like,
exactly.
Oh, you don't know what this means? Well, you can't be part of this conversation.
Yeah. So we had to be, from the early parts of my career, I had to learn how to explain something in a very, concise but direct way to people who didn't operate in that management consulting world, or didn't operate in the political world, or just had a different experience. And then also just had to be very sensitive to the fact that, if you're working in developing emerging market countries, they have a different experience. That they are in a different part of their overall trajectory or their journey or what have you.
Right.
So you have to be very humble and understanding of, hey, you know what? Hey, we don't know everything. Even though Americans think we don't know everything, and there's lots of things to learn. So there's that aspect of things too. And then, coming into it with most organizations are composed of actual individual people, who generally have good intentions. So where I work now, we try to approach it like, everyone actually has good intentions. We go into it with that sort of mindset. And everyone comes together because they want to try and make a difference and they want to try and improve things. So I think that intentionality, it's actually being intentional about things. It's not just, oh, this is the latest thing that everyone's supposed to do, so let's just, put somebody in this position or whatever. That's actually being intentional about, what's your strategy? What are you trying to accomplish? And taking yourself out of it. But what is it that you hear from the ecosystem? What is it they think is important? What are we trying to accomplish? And then breaking that down to, okay, what's the easy way for people to absorb and actually engage? So very sort of non-business terms, but I do think one of the things I found, and this is particularly because I'm in a world now where I just learned, I could not explain to you what like PBMs are or 340B. I know what Medicare and Medicaid are, but I actually apparently had it a little bit wrong. I didn't know exactly. So anyway, it's just being,
well,
that's try to talk like a regular person.
No, I mean, well, first off, I love that. But yeah, those are two good lessons. Like communications isn't really about you speaking or showing off or using fancy words. It's really about making connection to the audience or whoever you're speaking with. And I love that idea about, being humble and the strategy too. I guess that's the third point. Like, what are you actually trying to accomplish? And getting back to that, I mean, when somebody comes to you or you go to them, I mean, do you have a process where you're like, what is this person really trying to do? Or as an organization, are we really trying to do? Because I assume people say all kinds of stuff, but do you say to yourself, is this what this person really means? Or what is going on here? Or do you try to dig deeper?
Right, we do. I mean, we have this approach it's the listen first approach. And we'll let people talk, because I think a lot of times people just need to get things out. And then we ask a lot of probing questions. And before we even get to that point, I have colleagues who will have done what we call a policy landscape or policy analysis. They'll do some desk research, but then they'll also just talk generally to people, and they'll synthesize in a 1 or 2 page, hey, here are the big issues, here's the big legislative calendar, here are the big pieces of legislation you need to think about, and all that kind of stuff. So we have some sort of background knowledge. And then, we'll actually, my colleagues, I don't do this because I'm not on the project side of things. But they will actually develop a questionnaire. They're like, okay, here's the questions that we need to make sure, based on this research and insights gathering, whatever that we've done, here are the questions that we need to make sure we get answers to. And then, we will ask, most people do this, will ask, okay, what is it that we don't know? What is it that we missed?
Right.
Well, not everyone actually does ask, what is it that we missed? Or now, because, we should. And then it's interesting, and some organizations do this, but we do an after action report.
Oh, that's good.
Discussion after everything. And part of me was like, okay, this is too much. Just on the big ones, but we do it actually after all of our projects and whatnot, to figure out not only internally what could we have done better, but also, what did the conversation actually achieve? Did it miss the mark? We actually will survey after every single event that we do. We survey, okay, here's what we were trying to achieve. Did we actually achieve that? Did you learn X, Y, Z? And it's like, no, we didn't. And we're like, oh, oops. And we'll actually be like, oh, oops. Maybe we'll take that into consideration and figure out, should we actually do a different type of project? Should we do it differently? Or should we do the same type of thing again, but then, try and achieve what we did achieve the first time, if that makes sense.
After action reports are such a great tool, but I mean, I find myself personally, depending on like the project, sometimes, like, especially if it's like a legislation, right? Did you win or lose, or did the bill pass? So if you lost, you're not really interested in doing it. Or it's just tough too, because sometimes you put so much time and effort into a certain project. Once it's done, you're kind of relieved. And oh, by the way, you've got another one coming down the road, right. So you don't have time. So that discipline is good.
So luckily, we don't have to care about the legislation because we don't advocate. But what we do when we set up our project schedules, we actually will schedule the app. Like if we know the events, like we have an event on the 20th, it's a webinar, we have it on the 21st. And I think the after action is scheduled for the 22nd or 23rd. It's like, okay, everyone, get together.
But it's already on the calendar. No, that's great, because that's part of the process. Schedule it ahead of time. Good. Wrapping up here, I'm curious. So healthcare policy in the U.S. or healthcare spending, I guess, 20% of the economy, give or take, right? That's a huge. I mean, it's huge. It's vitally important. No pun intended. But there are other kind of big issues in the world. So I'm just curious, like, this seems like a very novel organization, the alliance you're working for. But let's say it's climate or the digital equity or technology. I mean, are you been approached by other groups? Or are you guys kind of at the forefront of, like, for lack of a better word, convening different voices and kind of getting people just to start the conversation on key topics around healthcare? But are there other organizations or people saying, hey, this is pretty cool, I want to be a part of this?
Yeah, no, we definitely have some conversations with some universities and we partner or work with a lot of foundations that are focused on, some that are focused on health policies, some that are focused on equity issues. But equity is a huge term. So we're like, hey, we don't do all equity. We can focus on maybe the health side of things. But we are really DC health policy focused. But what was interesting to me a few months ago, right before, like it's a few weeks before the World Bank meetings, which and I know that happened in Washington.
Fancy World Bank.
Yeah, a global health organization reached out and was like, hey, we've seen some of what you're doing. I'd love to have a conversation. And I was like, oh man. And I'm an internationalist at heart. That's my studied that. That's my background. This is for BRT, the Business Roundtable, and particularly the Alliance for Health Policy, where I am now, are the first really domestic focused efforts that I've worked on, or places where I've worked. Anyway, so long story short, I was like, oh yes, global health, we should definitely get involved in that. And I was like, oh man, that's not what we do. But I was able to point them to some other organizations that actually do, like where I used to work at the Council on Foreign Relations, which does have a global health program. And so I think they were able to connect on global issues. But yeah, so we partner, with payers, providers, universities, pharmaceutical industry, like I said, just large employers. Here's a good point. I'm actually going to make it part of my goal to specifically figure out how we can engage smaller and medium size. On issues.
No, it's so important, and there's so many. I'm in the same boat, and I really want to help them. And I know sometimes my approach is I'm so passionate about it that it's like, and it seems so common to me, like, hey, go to the World Bank or go to an embassy.
But it's hard.
But if you're talking to somebody who hasn't done that or even visited with their senator, I think sometimes the foreign policy stuff or any kind of any policy stuff, sometimes not making it welcoming or overwhelming people isn't a good approach.
Yeah. Well, Small Business Association and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has some smaller. It does focus on some small businesses, but like I said, the U.S. Small Business Association. But even then, there's like membership fees that they have to deal with and whatnot. So that's always been in the back of my mind to sort of figure out, is there a way to engage the smaller.
Well, now you're on the record. It's being recorded forever.
So
this will be on the internet forever.
It's still in my mind.
As we wrap up, Aimee,
sure.
It's intern season. Any advice? I'm just, because obviously you got degrees from UVA, Boston University. I don't know. Any advice? And you've done cool stuff, and I think people are like, wow, How can I be like Aimee when I grow up? Any
A,
advice or?
always consider what internships or fellowships you want to do, like several months ago, because our job have already started. But B, reach out to people. Like people like me always are, for the most part, are happy to take interns, fellows, whatever, out to coffee. We love to yammer on and talk about ourselves and our roles. But ask questions, and then don't feel badly about just, like we actually ask our fellows, because we have some med school students, hey, at the end of a meeting, we'll say, hey, is there anything, you guys have been listening to us, is there anything that we forgot or we didn't think about, or based on your experience, here's what questions that you have. So don't be afraid to just, raise your hand and get in there, because whoever you are, you just believe you belong at the table. And as long as you,
I love that.
As long as you communicate in a positive, well-intentioned way, all should be well.
Now in the policy world, yeah, I think if you're resourceful and you show up and show interest, I don't know, you can do some pretty crazy stuff at a pretty young age. Especially if you're resourceful. People like, I've had one intern who was so good. I was convincing him I was like, you need to drop out of college and come work for me. But he made the right decision, stayed in school. But once you find somebody resourceful,
let me go talk to my boss and tell him to back off our kids.
Now the internet's that's good. Aimee, this was great. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, lovely to meet you. And thank you for having me on.
This was great.